So good afternoon, everybody. I am super geeked to be doing this because I am absolutely in love with this musical. I've listened to it. I have it on a loop, kind of an endless loop in my car, listening to it again and again and again and again. So I'm really excited to be on this panel. And we thought that we were talking about maybe starting off by showing you, for those of you who've been under a rock and have no idea what this is about, to show you like the opening scene from this. And so what we're going to show you is actually when Lin-Manuel Miranda, who is the son of Puerto Rican immigrants, who thought it'd be a great idea to write this, to do a musical about the life of Alexander Hamilton, because why hasn't someone done it before, went to the White House and performed with the cast there. So we thought we'd show you that opening scene and then kind of be able to take it from there and talk to you about it. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you. Opening song, which kind of sets up Alexander Hamilton's life. And as I was saying, he was born in the West Indies, the illegitimate son of a Scotsman and his mother who was not married to his father, hence the whole illegitimacy thing. And he really had a lot of unfortunate encounters. His father abandoned them, he and his brother and his mother died shortly thereafter. He was then awarded custody to his cousin, and his cousin very shortly thereafter committed suicide. So, I mean, this guy had one thing after another in his background. But he was extremely smart. It was said that he had about 34 books in his house at the time, and he used to devour them. So if the idea of somebody having 34 books at a time when not a lot of people were literate is a pretty amazing thing. He was very self-taught, and after a hurricane blew in on St. Croix and he wrote a remarkable essay on it, he was given basically a scholarship to come to New York and to get an education. And he really wanted to be in New York where the action was at because the revolution was starting to heat up, and he knew that's where he needed to be. There's a quote, two quotes I wanted to throw out at you. One is really interesting, that the education of this future abolitionist was partly underwritten by sugarcane harvested by slaves, because St. Croix was an island that was engaged in the slave trade, and it was a particularly nasty business in the West Indies. And another quote is that the fact that this abominable childhood produced a strong, productive, self-reliant human being, this fatherless adolescent could have ended up a founding father of a country he'd not yet even seen, seems little short of miraculous. So he really kind of comes from these improbable backgrounds, and literally is kind of this Horatio Alger, kind of works his way up, pulls himself up by his own bootstraps and works his way up to end up being the aide-de-camp or secretary to General George Washington during the Revolution. Simply, again, on his own smarts. Anybody want to?
Yeah, I think part of our panel here is, and our mission is to kind of talk a bit about the context behind what makes Alexander Hamilton perhaps such an interesting figure to us now, given how similar or different we are from the time in which sort of he is living. And I think that Professor Fifelis brings up some very interesting sort of points about that, right? The West Indies is a incredibly brutal place at a time when sugar profits and slavery are central to the success of the British Empire, right? We need to view, right, his statements about wanting to take his shot, about in some ways wanting a war, you know, within the context of, you know, class and what it meant to try to raise oneself within that time. You know, I don't know if we would be able to say that Alexander Hamilton would be perhaps a radical by our standards, perhaps, or even sort of by his. You know, we should probably look to Thomas Paine much more so than him. You know, but there are ways to look at sort of what he does and what he is trying to do with some element of radicalism. And I think that certainly stands out, you know, sort of at that time. And if we're sort of telling, you know, sort of part of the timeline, I mean, can we continue from where you were saying, or we can? I don't know.
Does Jim, you want to add anything, Jim?
Yeah,
or
no,
you wanna
sure. I mean, Hamilton gets to New York and tries to get into Princeton. That goes rather interestingly.
Right.
But does become involved in the Revolution. And this was a chance for, I mean, a lot of the sort of preconditions going back to the end of the French and Indian War. There's something called Pontiac's Rebellion, and and a lot of it is perception between London and the colonies, where in London, for the second time in 20 years, the colonists started a war with Native Americans that they couldn't finish. British blood and treasure has had to be spent to do this, and so the new king, George III, says, enough, you can't go west. And so a lot of people of Hamilton's age viewed this as kind of being denied an opportunity. For someone like Hamilton, he would essentially, most people who had his background, I think we could agree, would probably end up at best maybe an indentured servant, like a part-time slave who probably would be impoverished for his entire life, and if he were lucky, maybe get an acre or two of ground that he could call his own. And so that's, I think, part of the mythos aspect of Alexander Hamilton. Instead of going along that trajectory, he ends up becoming Secretary of the Treasury, truly a self-made man. I mean, there's no one around him. He accumulates sponsors at different times, sure, but he works very doggedly to do that, and he works very hard once he's got some support. So I think it plays into that sort of American, rags to riches story as well. And for many people of his age, the revolution was that opportunity. And so that's why he jumps on board, and he does. He gains notice. It's also, I think, important to realize that Washington's staff, the term they used then was his family, his military family, because they literally spent pretty much 24/7 together, which means that Alexander Hamilton, as a 20-something, is getting a chance to meet people who will eventually shape the United States and forge relationships with them that are already a decade old by the time he enters New York politics. So I think that kind of takes us through a little bit further.
That was something I actually found kind of interesting too about the relationship. If those of you who are familiar with the musical, within the musical, it's kind of made it seem as though Alexander Hamilton and George Washington have this kind of very paternalistic father-son kind of relationship. And one of the things I found interesting in the Chernow biography was talking about how it seemed like Washington viewed him that way, but Hamilton really didn't seem to view Washington the same way, did not have a really close relationship the way it's kind of described. He seemed to respect him tremendously, and whatever criticisms he had of him were private, but he didn't seem to kind of have that same sort of look. And this could be because he was he was a man without a father. And so it could be that maybe he had difficulty trusting or whatever that means. The psychological stuff I'll leave to the experts. But he definitely was not as close and attached to George Washington as it was made to appear. But he definitely had tremendous respect for him. And it's the general who kind of helps propel his career because he attaches his fortunes to the general, recognizing that if he wants to have his shot and get somewhere, this is the way to do it because he's eager to fight the whole time. And Washington is reluctant to give him a command because he's really his right-hand guy. Like, he's the guy that can translate Washington's letters into French because he's fluent in French, and he was able to capture Washington's tone. He was an excellent writer, and so he just had this ability that made him indispensable to Washington. But the whole time, he's kind of chafing because he wants more. He wants to get this military command, which he's finally given towards the end of the war.
Yeah.
I know, and throughout the war too, but I think his big kind of moment comes, I believe, at Yorktown.
Yeah.
And that's something, to build on, right? That it's important to clarify that context, right? Washington doesn't have, sort of any biological children of his own, and so he looked in some cases on some of these young officers, these young men as nearly sons. Within the late 18th century, that idea of service in the British Army sort of as an officer or achieving military glory was an essential way to have financial, social, and cultural success. Remember, we're still dealing with a time where birthright nobility means something. It truly does. And so while the English have their sort of middle class and sort of working towards it, you're still working against a system where having a patron, having someone who favors you, means a great deal. Well, we don't have that same birthright nobility in the new constitutional system and everything of, you're still operating from that as a cultural sort of precept. So for someone sort of like Hamilton, right, having these backers is very important. But then again, he's not the only one amongst the founders to have sort of that type of backing. I mentioned Paine earlier, right? He's someone who is favored or at least backed at the beginning by Benjamin Franklin, right? One favors the other.
Did you want anything, Jim, or you want me to?
I'm good at the moment.
Okay. So let's talk about the duel. I mean,
Okay.
do all of you know how Alexander Hamilton died? Who was Burr? The vice. So the Treasury of the Secretary, who is at this point retired from that, but he is he gets shot and killed by the Vice President of the United States. So if you thought that Dick Cheney shooting a friend of his in the face was really bad, a couple years ago back in the Bush administration, this was even more
Yeah,
scandalous.
imagine
The
that.
idea that
Yeah.
the Vice President killed this famous Federalist figure, one of the most famous politicians in the country, in a duel. So I don't know, do you want to maybe start off by talking a little bit about duels and the idea, and then we could take it from there?
And appropriately enough, the duel happened in an area of North Jersey that was later became known as a mob dumping ground. So it kind of continued a tradition. I'm born on the East Coast. At any rate, we know these things, but we don't talk about them.
We
At
know
any
what
rate,
dumping grounds are.
no. As far as the duel went, yeah, and it's also important to point out. I think a lot of times with both the musical and the Chernow biography, Hamilton's the hero, but he was really a human being. He was an instigator. He started it.
Yeah.
This was not his. This was his last duel, for obvious reasons. But it was not his. It was far from his only one. And most of them he started. There's something called the Code Duello that evolves out of the Middle Ages. It really comes. Actually, I did some looking at this. The version that becomes popular in the U.S. was promulgated in Ireland, and the key thing is the purpose of the code is, in essence, to prevent a duel from happening. Once, you've probably seen in the movies, right? It doesn't always happen this way, where someone slaps someone else with the white glove. No, they can basically say that's it. It can be the same thing we might remember from grammar school of, I call you out, right? But the idea is, from that point on, they will usually set a date about a month or two later, and the two belligerents, two guys who have the fight, cannot see one another. And so you hear about these seconds. Well, they communicate back and forth, but most of what they do is, bring a message of saying, hey, look, he's willing to let this go if you'll apologize. Like, say, there was an insult at a public place. So, okay, if we meet up at a public, and we don't even have to say, right, say in this situation, it wouldn't be like, hey, everybody, look, Josh, I'm really sorry. We could just actually stand in the corner, have this apology, and then as long as it's negotiated. And at the very end, should it come to an actual duel, there's also this whole very strict set of rules that have to be involved, because you also have a criminal justice system, and essentially you are going to have a murder. Someone has a good chance of getting killed here, and so they have things like, it talks about the oarsmen who row them over have to turn their backs, because then they're not witnesses. Yeah, even the doctor had to turn his back and could only turn around after the shots are fired, and then go and say, okay, look, and there's a lot of dispute too as to, and again, part of that throwing away my shot. You could even then, the standard was you would shoot off and away to the ground. So, and it's a one-shot gun. So once your gun is unloaded, if you have the first shot, you're basically saying, look, I'm good, we're not going to fight, which then throws it all on the other person. If they fire, they're committing murder because they are shooting an unarmed person. Okay, so, and again, all this is sort of written out. There's 10 points for a successful duel.
Yeah. The 10 duel commandments, if you want to listen to that one. That actually happens twice. Well, the ironic thing is that Hamilton's son also died in a duel defending his father. His father was involved, and we could talk about this too, a scandalous affair in which he basically published a pamphlet saying, yeah, I had an adulterous affair with this woman, and her husband and the wife were basically trying to extort money out of me. His career, his ambition meant more to him than maybe going public and embarrassing his wife. He didn't want to, although this did end any presidential ambitions he might have had. But with the publication of that pamphlet out in the open, his son fought a duel, I think it was like in the late 1790s, I believe, and he's killed in the duel. And so that had a major impact. So it was, by all accounts, Hamilton was not a great lover of duels, although he participated in a number of them throughout his career. One of them early on during the war, when General Lee was criticizing General Washington, and his friend John Lawrence calls him out, and they fight a duel, and that's the first time you hear the 10 Duel Commandments in the musical. Let's see, are there any questions or sorry? Yeah, yes, sir.
Why are the people in their undergarments in the play?
Okay, so this is definitely. Oh, go ahead.
I'll let you take that. Yeah.
Okay. This is definitely a very unorthodox musical. Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote it with the idea that he wants it to be a reflection of what America is like now, not what America was like back in the 18th century and early 19th century. So he casts a diverse group of people. So the actor who plays George Washington is black. Lin-Manuel Miranda, who plays Hamilton, is son of Puerto Rican immigrants of Puerto Rican descent. And so it's the woman who plays Angelica Schuyler is black. His wife, I believe, and I'm not certain, I want to say that I think she's part Asian. So it's a very interesting kind of mix of people. And so the cast almost acts like a chorus, if you will, throughout. And so I think that was just part of the unorthodoxy of it. He was trying to, I think, capture an audience. And one way to do it is to show women in their corsets. So, that's kind of one way to get people to pay attention. Yes, Linda? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Jim.
No, the comment was just that from the neck down, they're in period costume, but their heads, they're from the neck up, it's all contemporary.
Other questions? Yes, sir. Aaron
Burr.
Sir. Yes. Are you Aaron Burr, sir?
I think
There's another question back there.
I can't necessarily speak to his personal family, but in terms of effect on dueling, I can say that it didn't necessarily. Dueling itself was decreasing, but the idea of a sort of honor code amongst members of the gentry, amongst members of what we might call today the sort of 1%, that doesn't decrease. I mean, most famously so. You have a congressman, bludgeoning a senator on the floor of the Senate in the 1850s over sort of the issues over slavery, and the whole idea was that he had insulted him, right? So even though the actual dueling with dueling pistols and sort of these types of things decreases to a certain extent, you have at least within the planter class of slave owners and other portions of the upper class around the country a belief that to the upper class different laws apply or don't apply. So, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I think you also get like a sort of regional change there, too,
Yeah.
where it definitely becomes less popular and more almost shunned in the North.
Right.
And I've actually seen, I heard a paper a few years ago where a Southern Army officer was actually arrested for assault in the North when he called it a duel, and in the North they called it, no, that's assault with a cane, that's assault and battery. So and again, that feeds into the regionalism that eventually contributes to the Civil War. So.
Mm-hmm. And I'd just like to make an observation, if I may, that this is at a time when women were viewed as the weaker sex and could not vote and had no political voice, yet men were having battles with guns because somebody called me a bad name, and so I can't take being called a bad name, so let me fight you because you're calling me a bad name. So I just want to throw that out there.
And maybe that's something to clarify of, the great question, if Lin-Manuel Miranda was here would be, why Hamilton, right? And Ron Chernow wrote an incredible biography, and of course what they're doing with the story of Hamilton's life is using it as a platform to have a dialogue about who we are as a people today through the lens of what we were sort of at that time. Although there are aspects of truth within it, right? Every single moment, of course, is not an accurate representation of historical reality. If we were to discuss every aspect of Hamilton's very prominent political career in the 1780s and in the 1790s, not just as Secretary of the Treasury, but as a leading figure within the Federalist Party he has some pretty strong opinions about things like free speech or the lack thereof, of war, of debt, of whether or not as a military officer he can, arrest people in Pennsylvania for making whiskey and those types of things. He is an extremely significant figure within this period of the founding. But yes.
I was asked a question. In the play, he fights against Thomas Jefferson, who said in the Declaration of Independence everybody's equal.
Right.
But Jefferson still kept slaves in Washington, and they were
Awkward.
discussing
Yeah.
whether or not they could pay off the slave owners for the slaves and free them, like the English were going to do in 1808 and a few years down the future.
So, do we have time? You want maybe play a little bit of the cabinet battle, or do you think we maybe have a couple minutes? Maybe, like, do you guys mind, or that's because that's one of the ones I think if we're going to play any of them, that's because that's about the rivalry between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton over basically how is this new country going to look. And Alexander Hamilton, as Professor Fulton pointed out, had a very specific vision for how he wanted it to work, to be more of a commercial, banking, financial center, whereas Thomas Jefferson viewed it as more of like this agrarian republic of like small, independent farmers and that kind of a vision. And those two completely clashed.
And to your point about quoting Jefferson and everything, of keeping in mind through all of this, how they view race and how we view race are of course two totally different things, right? Yeah, when they say all men are created equal, they are saying all freeborn white men who have property are created
and are of English descent.
And are of English descent are equal. Everybody else, sorry.
Doesn't really count. Yeah. And while Hamilton wasn't necessarily, he was an abolitionist. He did advocate the abolition of slavery, but he didn't apply the Hamiltonian zeal, let's say, that he applied to other things, to the issue, to the cause of slavery. So.
Yeah.
A lot of what we were saying. And this style is awesome, right? I mean, it's something that's appealing, I think, especially to a younger audience, which is what he had intended. But you're getting two kind of different visions of what this country was going to look like. The idea of Hamilton saying this country needs a line of credit, the same way that if you want to buy a car, you have to have established credit, right? It's the same principle. The country had to establish credit in order to establish itself as a worthy nation that could borrow and kind of engage in trade with the rest of the world. So, yeah, I'll stop there. Any other thoughts on that?
Question, yes.
Kind of a comment more. I thought from reading the book and listening how much has not changed politically since then. Because, those in office, can you repeat that?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted any of you to comment on Hamilton. He's a successful guy. He's a lawyer. Yet he engages in this affair, which eventually causes his ruination.
Mhm.
Where was his brain?
I got a couple theories on that, but I don't know if I can say it in public. So,
I think Lin-Manuel, I think that might be in the sequel from Lin-Manuel Noriega. Right.
there was one point you made, though, that I picked up on about, made me think of Washington's farewell address and him addressing it. But what was the first thing you said, if you could say before?
It's very similar.
How much politics are similar?
Oh, how they're
today,
similar, yeah. Because, thank you, how the politics are similar. Do you guys mind? I keep talking, I'm sorry. You
think
want to go ahead?
I can. I mean,
I keep babbling.
I think most people would certainly, most scholars would agree that, yeah, we're dealing with some of the same issues. I mean, in the 1780s with the Constitutional Convention, the big debates are over use of government, right, and how much of government, whether or not government is fundamentally good, and then the systems sort of around that. Where things, I would say, probably have changed might be over how we debate sort of politics publicly, and whether or not it can be debated publicly. and especially what we ask and expect from our politicians publicly. Right now we're in the midst of another fairly long presidential election process, and it's an extremely public process, on all sides. In that period, it would not be, right? It would be seen as completely beneath anyone who would assume the presidency to put themselves out there sort of in that way, of that at some level they did not deserve the presidency, the office of the presidency, because they were seeking it. They would be seen as really sort of self-serving and traitors to the sovereign, which would be the people. I would absolutely agree that many of the same themes from then certainly sort of translate to now, but that would be one that would certainly be very different. We expect to hear from our politicians, and our politicians in the 1790s didn't feel they needed us to do really much of anything.
Well, and building on that, I think it also, I think you get this, it's a 180 from, in the 1790s you have disinterest, where, a politician in the 1790s would say, if you would like my services, I will serve. Whereas today, we expect them to beg us for our vote. Where if you did that, kind of build on what you said, if you did that in the 1790s, that would just generate sort of a concern over why do you want that office so much? They would almost assume you were corrupt. Because if you wanted the office that much, it must be for some nefarious purpose. You want to, and maybe they were onto something there. Maybe they had it all figured out in that respect.
Well, I certainly think it's true that if you are seeking out the presidency, you do have to have a certain amount of ambition in order to do that. And Aaron Burr actually did some of that kind of politicking, going door to door when he was running for president in 1800. But I wanted to go back to what you were saying about the partisanship. That was one of the things that in 1796, when President Washington makes this rather dramatic decision to not seek another term. There were no presidential term limits at the time. He could have kept running for life, and he voluntarily stepped down. Now, my theory has to do more with the fact that if you ever look at the before and after photographs of presidents, before they look great and after they look like the crypt keeper from Tales from the Crypt, because it exhausts them. But he makes this decision to step down, and he says, I want to teach the country how to say goodbye and move on. That's one of the lyrics from the musical. And he warns against the idea of partisan fighting that he did not like to see breaking out between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. But he makes that decision. And one of the great moments, and I really wish we could show so much more of this, is when the King George III kind of features almost as this character who keeps coming in, and he has these great songs. But the last one is where he's like, I'm perplexed about Washington stepping down. He's like, I didn't know a person could do that. Like, he never imagined that somebody, are they just going to keep trading rulers again and again? Someone new is going to take the job all the time? Like, I didn't know that could possibly happen. That's kind of a great, and the fact that Washington took that stance set up a precedent for future presidents to follow, and the idea of this transitionary government that every couple terms we have a new president that comes into power, and there are no a la Russia dictatorships for life that are occurring. So, other questions? Yeah, sure.
So really quick backtracking, you said Hamilton was an antagonist, correct?
Yes.
So I'm assuming Burr kind of requested the duel out.
So, you want me to? Okay.
What is the duel about?
What was the duel about? Okay. I'll try to give you the quick kind of sketch. But basically, Burr claimed that Hamilton basically, in multiple times, they had been friends early on, and that friendship had been tested at multiple times. Burr ran for a seat in the Senate, I believe it was the state Senate, and defeated Hamilton's father-in-law, General Schuyler. And so that was kind of one moment, and the fact that Hamilton said some negative things about Burr when Burr was running for governor that Burr believed caused him to lose the election. And it ended up in the newspaper, in the Albany Register. And so there was this idea that basically Burr felt that, whether it was fair or not, he felt that Hamilton had maligned his character to the degree that the only way he could get satisfaction back and regain his honor was to seek satisfaction in a duel. And it began as 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 Professor McIntyre alluded to, this war of words that kind of escalates. Hamilton sends him a letter back, and then there was one word they both kind of got caught up in, and there were moments where both could have backed down, and then they just didn't. Whether it was pride or whatever it might be, it just continued to escalate and escalate to the point where I guess neither one of them felt they could back down. And then they called for the idea of meeting in outside of Weehawken, New Jersey, to have this duel. So, yes, sir.
Is there any significant difference between if the person who initially instigated the duel, killed the person, or the person who was challenged to the duel killed the person?
Could you say that again?
In terms of 'cause I know you said they had kind of a very honorable kind of system.
Right.
They were really about the honor. Was there any significant difference between if the person who started the duel killed the other person, or the person who was challenged killed that person?
Was there significance if the person who started the duel killed the opponent versus that? I'm not sure of either.
As long as the code is observed, in other words, as long as things are done the way they're supposed to be done, if the usually the challenger, say pistols are popular with this, so say the challenger fires their shot and misses unintentionally, and again, smoothbore weapons are incredibly unreliable. So I could aim at you and hit over there, if the weather conditions are right. So, okay, but if I aimed at you, and this is why you have some people witness, right? So I aim, I shoot, I miss, you shoot, you hit, I die. It's okay. Okay. Even if the challenger fails, if the other person decides to carry it through. Now there is that moment too, where you could look at it and say, well, you missed. So you know what? I'm going to prove that I'm better than you and say it's all okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, at any stage in this, there is a room to back out and preserve your honor and even make yourself look better,
right,
and follow this code. Again, to me, it all comes back to, I think the fundamental idea is to prevent people from actually killing each other in back alleys.
And there's
and preserving one's honor. I mean, I think that's really what this is all about, is the idea that being an honorable member of this gentry, right, being an honorable member of this sort of group, an honorable gentleman, meant so much that they were more than willing to possibly risk their lives, right, for their social identity, right? It's a very, very, very powerful thing.
And I think for both Burr and Hamilton, it's doubly so, because even Burr's biography, I mean, he loses his mother, his father, his grandfather, all within the course of 2 years as a young man. Mm-hmm. So you have two guys who both really kind of struggled. Granted, Hamilton more than Burr, and I think both were very, they both worked very hard to climb up through society and were keenly aware of their social position. And that notion of honor, it needs to be kind of constantly defended for both of them. Mm-hmm. Right. Whereas I always like to think that a George Washington who never fights a duel, he can, if someone challenges him, he can say, well, you're beneath my contempt. And most of his contemporaries would go, yeah, because, you're one of the richest men in Virginia, you come from a long, great line of people, and all these things that build your honor, and you've got them all, so,
you're good. Yeah.
You're good. But he could walk away and keep his honor intact. He could refuse and still be honorable.
Go ahead.
We're just about out of time.
Yeah.
Can we wrap up with a question about his legacy? How do we view Hamilton, and how has the musical maybe changed that legacy?
For sure. Do you guys mind? Sure. I mean, the fact that, this guy leaves a tremendous legacy, this guy, that's very glib. The fact that he basically creates our budgetary system, right? He basically creates a central bank. He basically creates the Customs Service and the Coast Guard. He's responsible for all those things. And in terms of just, and I'll make this brief so my colleagues can make a few comments too, the fact that this musical, I think, has really just sort of shaped, I think it's gotten a new generation of people probably interested in Alexander Hamilton who never would have been otherwise. Like, why would you ever think to be interested in Alexander Hamilton? So he really had a tremendous impact on this nation, and was appreciated much more after his death. I think he wasn't very well liked when he was alive. It's one of those things where, when you die, you get better, you get something likable, and that's kind of what happened with him. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think his legacy, as Professor Fifoli says, is multifold. Aside from his contributions to the creation of the American economy and the early years of the American political system, you end up with the legacy of a life that sort of defined the early American experience in a way. And in terms of the musical, it has certainly made it okay, right, to use history as an avenue to discuss a wide spectrum of things. And I think that if that is in the service of the public good and honor that Hamilton is talking about, that they're talking about the musical, then that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I would almost start with the second part. I think the musical has made Hamilton someone we can talk about. It's kind of rescued him from virtual obscurity. We hear about Washington and Franklin. Hamilton is like a far, fifth place until this musical. And I think it's also, as far as his legacy at the time, it was very checkered. I mean, I think on one hand too, it also leaves a challenge for us because he's not the hero all the time. A number of people of his own party, including John Adams, were really glad when he fell from power because Alexander Hamilton, if he believed he was right, had no problems, stabbing even close supporters in the back to accomplish something. So he was not liked at the time, and there were people who were generally fearful of him for good reason, too. So, I mean, and I think it opens up a lot of those questions that are still very current in our society. And it gives us a lens through which to view them and a place to discuss them.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.